Every so often, when a conversation about socialism comes up, someone will supply a link to presentations by Kitty Werthmann, an Austrian who lived through Nazi Germany, as a testimony to the evils of socialism. First off, I shouldn't have to point out that anecdotes aren't good arguments, and secondly, most people understand by now that the German National Socialists were not actually socialists by any Marxist standard. There was the Night of Long Knives, in which they purged the socialists from the party and kept the name. Well, after seeing clips of this old lady paraded out for the millionth time, I figured I'd go over the transcript of her speech and see if her problem was with socialism or just dictatorship.
What I am about to tell you is something you've probably never heard or will ever read in history books. I believe that I am an eyewitness to history. I cannot tell you that Hitler took Austria by tanks and guns. It would distort history. We elected him by a landslide as 98% of the vote. I've never read that in any American publications. Everyone thinks that Hitler just rolled in with his tanks and took Austria by force.
What? I never heard that anywhere. I was always taught, both in school and in general knowledge, that the Austrians welcomed the Germans with open arms. They'd been pushing for it previously under the idea of Mitteleuropa, a unification of all Germanic countries. Austria pretty much already considered themselves Germans, so it was pretty much a voluntary annexation. And Hitler himself was Austrian, so he was their local boy. In March of 1938, when German troops came into Austria, they were greeted by cheering crowds.
In 1938, Austria was in deep depression. Nearly one-third of our workforce was unemployed. We had 25% inflation and 25% bank loan interest rates. Farmers and business people were declaring bankruptcy daily. Young people were going from house to house begging for food. Not that they didn't want to work, there simply weren't any jobs. My mother was a Christian woman and believed in helping people in need. Every day we cooked a big kettle of soup and baked bread to feed those poor, hungry people, about 30 daily.
Keep in mind at this point, Austria was a corporatist paramilitary republic and the Weimar Republic was a capitalist constitutional monarchy. She talks about people begging for food. Isn't that what they always tell us is a socialist thing? The bread lines and mass hunger? The people always being poor? Funny, it's almost like capitalism is subject to the same issues and isn't any better at defending against it really at all. And we still see it. Remember that huge bread line in Texas during COVID? And get this, her solution is for her mother, someone with the resources to do so, cooks bread and soup and distributes it freely to the poor. She produced according to her ability and gave to each according to their needs. So far this isn't really a good defense of capitalism. It's promoting socialist values utilizing the very left-leaning teachings of Jesus as a delivery method.
The Communist Party and the National Socialist Party were fighting each other. Blocks and blocks of cities like Vienna, Linz, and Graz were destroyed. The people became desperate and petitioned the government to let them decide what kind of government they wanted. We looked to our neighbor on the north, Germany, where Hitler had been in power since 1933. We had been told that they didn't have unemployment or crime, and they had a high standard of living. Nothing was ever said about persecution of any group, Jewish or otherwise. We were led to believe that everyone was happy.
Reminds me of how America tells everyone that it's a land of opportunity and that everyone is welcome. But a lot of people have a much different experience once they get there.
We wanted the same way of life in Austria. We were promised that a vote for Hitler would mean the end of unemployment and help for the family. Hitler also said that businesses would be assisted, and farmers would get their farms back. 98% of the population voted to annex Austria to Germany and have Hitler for our ruler. We were overjoyed, and for 3 days we danced in the streets and had candlelight parades. The new government opened up big field kitchens and everyone was fed. After the election, German officials were appointed, and like a miracle, we suddenly had law and order. 3 or 4 weeks later, everyone was employed. The government made sure that a lot of work was created through the public works service. Hitler decided we should have equal rights for women. Before this, it was a custom that married Austrian women did not work outside the home. An able-bodied husband would be looked down on if he couldn't support his family. Many women in the teaching profession were elated that they could retain the jobs they previously had been required to give up for marriage.
Yeah, that's one thing people like to gloss over. Hitler wasn't a cartoonish supervillain. He was also a vegetarian for a while and invented animal welfare laws. Being an artist, it makes sense that he'd have some progressive views, but nobody would vote for him if he just came out and said he wants to be the boot pressing on your face forever. Evil people are still people. They pet dogs and kiss babies. If you met him in person, you probably wouldn't even know he was a piece of shit until after he did something.
Our education was nationalized. I attended a very good public school. The population was predominantly Catholic, so we had religion in our schools. The day we elected Hitler, March 13, 1938, I walked into my schoolroom to find the crucifix replaced by Hitler's picture hanging next to a Nazi flag. Our teacher, a very devout woman, stood up and told the class we wouldn't pray or have religion anymore. Instead, we sang Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles, and had physical education. Sunday became National Youth Day with compulsory attendance. Parents were not pleased about the sudden change in curriculum. They were told that if they did not send us, they would receive a stiff letter of warning the first time. The second time they would be fined the equivalent of $300, and the third time they would be subject to jail. The first 2 hours consisted of political indoctrination. The rest of the day we had sports. As time went along, we loved it. Oh, we had so much fun and got our sports equipment free. We would go home and gleefully tell our parents about the wonderful time we had.
Okay, well first off, she starts with the fact that their schools were nationalized and that it was a good thing that they were all happy with. Again, not exactly a good argument against socialism. Next, she complains that religion was removed from school and replaced with Nazi youth propaganda. She just went from one propaganda to another propaganda, worshipping one giant overbearing institution to another. Removing religion from school is a good thing, and inversely, removing patriotism is a good thing. Kids should be going to school to learn empirical facts, not indoctrination. If you want to teach your kids that theism is true or that the state is awesome, you can do that at home because those aren't facts, they are opinions.
My mother was very unhappy. When the next term started, she took me out of public school and put me in a convent. I told her she couldn't do that and she told me that someday when I grew up, I would be grateful. There was a very good curriculum, but hardly any fun, no sports, and no political indoctrination. I hated it at first but felt I could tolerate it. Every once in a while, on holidays, I went home. I would go back to my old friends and ask what was going on and what they were doing. Their loose lifestyle was very alarming to me. They lived without religion. By that time unwed mothers were glorified for having a baby for Hitler. It seemed strange to me that our society changed so suddenly. As time went along, I realized what a great deed my mother did so that I wasn't exposed to that kind of humanistic philosophy.
Well, that seems like a pretty gross misrepresentation of humanism, but I don't see how the Catholic Church, whom were generally complicit, were any better. Instead of having babies for Hitler, the Church told them to be fruitful and multiply for the glory of God. Exact same message, just different tyrant. And she outs herself as a moral Puritan because she doesn't really make a case as to how the looseness was an issue. Just that she looked down on it with disdain because of her preference for religious doctrine.
In 1939, the war started and a food bank was established. All food was rationed and could only be purchased using food stamps. At the same time, a full employment law was passed which meant if you didn't work, you didn't get a ration card, and if you didn't have a card, you starved to death. Women who stayed home to raise their families didn't have any marketable skills and often had to take jobs more suited for men.
At this point, the Nazis were getting situated in their fascist corporatist boots, so that level of control seems par for the course for authoritarians. And it's funny to me how everything she's describing now could be said of the United States. You don't have a card, but if you don't work, you face the prospect of starving on the street and would have to rely on charity simply to live. Functionally the same. It's normal now for both parents to work, even jobs that they are not suited for, and we have food banks to supplement. Again, her description isn't that far off of a worker's current situation under capitalism.
Soon after this, the draft was implemented. It was compulsory for young people, male and female, to give 1 year to the labor corps. During the day, the girls worked on the farms, and at night they returned to their barracks for military training just like the boys. They were trained to be anti-aircraft gunners and participated in the Signal Corps. After the labor corps, they were not discharged but were used in the front lines. When I go back to Austria to visit my family and friends, most of these women are emotional cripples because they just were not equipped to handle the horrors of combat. 3 months before I turned 18, I was severely injured in an air raid attack. I nearly had a leg amputated, so I was spared having to go into the labor corps and into military service.
Yes, all good arguments on why there shouldn't be a draft, which the United States also had. Also, the assumption that women aren't capable of handling war but men are is kind of sexist. Men come back from combat with PTSD all the time, and that's pretty normal human reaction to such a thing.
When the mothers had to go out into the workforce, the government immediately established child care centers. You could take your children ages 4 weeks to school age and leave them there around the clock, 7 days a week, under the total care of the government. The state raised a whole generation of children. There were no motherly women to take care of the children, just people highly trained in child psychology. By this time, no one talked about equal rights. We knew we had been had.
Well, motherly women seems pretty vague, but a daycare is much like a school. It's a place for parents to drop off their kids for a while. How is this any different than leaving your kids at school or a daycare while you work today? Except for the fact that you gotta pay for it. I went to daycare and it was awful. But to say that the state raised all of these kids is to say that you were all lazy parents, because the kids obviously come home at some point and you can raise them yourselves. A daycare doesn't raise kids, they just babysit. That part's supposed to be on you.
Before Hitler, we had very good medical care. Many American doctors trained at the University of Vienna. After Hitler, healthcare was socialized, free for everyone. Doctors were salaried by the government. The problem was, since it was free, the people were going to the doctors for everything. When the good doctor arrived at his office at 8 a.m., 40 people were already waiting and, at the same time, the hospitals were full. If you needed elective surgery, you had to wait a year or two for your turn. There was no money for research as it was poured into socialized medicine. Research at the medical schools literally stopped, so the best doctors left Austria and emigrated to other countries.
Weird how she stated that there was no money for research, when the Nazis are infamous for conducting unethical medical research. Also, Dr. Alan Wells states that World War II era Germans were extremely advanced in medicine, technology, and public health research. So maybe the experts know more about what was going on than some layman with anecdotal experience. Now, I hate to say this of an old lady that survived Nazi Germany, but I think she's a massive exaggerator. I hear the same arguments about socialized medicine from Americans today who don't realize I live in a country with somewhat socialized medicine, and it works rather well. People aren't dying en masse in waiting rooms. Multiple studies have been conducted that concluded that socialized medicine would actually save money compared to the current system in America.
As for healthcare, our tax rates went up to 80% of our income. Newlyweds immediately received a $1,000 loan from the government to establish a household. We had big programs for families. All daycare and education were free. High schools were taken over by the government and college tuition was subsidized. Everyone was entitled to free handouts, such as food stamps, clothing, and housing.
Wow, that sounds fucking awesome! And she seems to agree because she doesn't mention any downside except the tax rate. And an 80% tax rate does seem a bit excessive. So much so that I decided to look it up, and it turns out that nobody paid that much. Again, she is overtly exaggerating. I will read this snippet from German historian Gutzali. One Reich strategy, then, was to shift responsibility for funding the Nazi war machine to the citizens of conquered lands, while continuing to spare the majority of its own population any increased tax burden. Repeatedly over the course of the spring and summer of 1939, civil servants tried to raise tax rates, only to find themselves undercut by the Nazi leadership, which intervened to protect lower and middle-income Germans. This procedural give and take is evident in the work of the Ministerial Council for the Defense of the Reich, which was formed on August 30th, 1939, to draw up a blueprint for wartime taxation. 5 days later, it published a draft of the Wartime Economy Ordinance. I'm not even going to try and pronounce that. Paragraph 22 of the ordinance imposed an additional wartime tax of 50% on all wages, but also promptly excluded all but the wealthiest Germans, those with annual incomes of more than 2,400 Reichsmarks. In practice, that exempted 70% of the German population, an additional 26%, those earning between 4 and 6,000 marks, incurred only minor additional charges. In the end, only 4% of the population paid the 50% surcharge. So there you have it. Even if she was one of the richest people in the Reich, she would not be paying 80%. And the facts seem to contradict the idea that the Nazis gouged their people with taxes, but rather used the plunder of their enemies to fund things.
We had another agency designed to monitor business. My brother-in-law owned a restaurant that had square tables. Government officials told him he had to replace them with round tables because people might bump themselves on the corners. Then they said he had to have additional bathroom facilities. It was just a small dairy business with a snack bar. He couldn't meet all the demands. Soon, he went out of business. If the government owned the large businesses and not many small ones existed, it could be in control.
Capitalism is full of agencies that monitor business. Is she suggesting that regulations themselves are bad, or that they just had bad regulations? And the picture is starting to become clear to me. She hasn't once really criticized the economic model of socialism. Her problem is solely with authoritarianism, which is a government model and independent of economics. And instead of the government benefiting from the death of small business, it's the corporate oligarchy that benefits. I once again don't see how that's better, because at least there is some ostensibly democratic control of the government. There is no public control of a corporation. They are only beholden to their stockholders, who in turn are only interested in seeking profits. Their only obligation to the public is to not create a disaster so large that they lose business.
In 1944, I was a student teacher in a small village in the Alps. The villagers were surrounded by mountain passes which, in the winter, were closed off with snow, causing people to be isolated. So people intermarried and offspring were sometimes retarded.
Ooh, the Arsler. I guess we can let it slide though, because she is a pre-boomer lady and she doesn't know better.
When I arrived, I was told there were 15 mentally retarded adults, but they were all useful and did good manual work. I knew one, named Vincent, very well. He was a janitor of the school. One day I looked out the window and saw Vincent and others getting into a van. I asked my superior where they were going. She said to an institution where the state health department would teach them a trade, and to read and write. The families were required to sign papers with a little clause that they could not visit for 6 months. They were told visits would interfere with the program and might cause homesickness. As time passed, letters started to dribble back saying these people died a natural, merciful death. The villagers were not fooled. We suspected what was happening. Those people left in excellent physical health and all died within 6 months. We called this euthanasia.
Well then, I guess it's a good thing that Marx wrote about the abolition of the state, so that socialists wouldn't have to worry about big government death squads. Again, that is authoritarianism you have a problem with. Plenty of capitalist countries have totalitarian despots that make people disappear.
Next came gun registration. People were getting injured by guns. Hitler said that the real way to catch criminals, we still had a few, was by matching serial numbers on guns. Most citizens were law-abiding and dutifully marched to the police station to register their firearms. Not long afterwards, the police said that it was best for everyone to turn in their guns. The authorities already knew who had them, so it was futile not to comply voluntarily.
Well, I can agree with that last part. Keeping your guns would have been completely futile. Like what, if the Jews in the ghetto had just kept their guns, they would have single-handedly beaten the Nazi army? No, brandishing a gun against a state that has a monopoly on violence just gives them an excuse to gun you all down. Even if the Austrian people kept all of their guns, there were still lots of loyalists, so they just end up shooting each other and not the Germans. Take for instance Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. The anti-Semites were just waiting for an excuse, and after a teenage Polish Jew shot Ernst von Rath, a German diplomat, they used that as an excuse to go purge the violent Jews. It doesn't matter if you're right or wrong, violence begets violence. If you saw my video on the assault rifle ban, you already know this, but gun control is not the same thing as a gun ban. Conflating the two is a slippery slope fear-mongering tactic.
No more freedom of speech. Anyone who said something against the government was taken away. We knew many people who were arrested, not only Jews, but also priests and ministers who spoke up. Totalitarianism didn't come quickly. It took 5 years from 1938 until 1943 to realize full dictatorship in Austria. Had it happened overnight, my countrymen would have fought to the last breath. Instead, we had creeping gradualism. Now, our only weapons were broom handles. The whole idea sounds almost unbelievable that the state, little by little, eroded our freedom. After World War II, Russian troops occupied Austria. Women were raped, preteen to elderly. The press never wrote about this either. When the Soviets left in 1955, they took everything that they could, dismantling whole factories in the process. They sawed down whole orchards of fruit, and what they couldn't destroy, they burned. We called it the burned earth. Most of the population barricaded themselves in their houses. Women hid in their cellars for 6 weeks as the troops mobilized. Those who couldn't, paid the price. There is a monument in Vienna today, dedicated to those women who were massacred by the Russians. This is an eyewitness account.
It is true that the Russian army did that, and it's obviously a terrible and indefensible war crime. However, if you think the mass rape was bad, I got bad news for you. The Allies did the same shit for the same fucking reasons. The German army pushed deep into Russia and raped a bunch of people when they were there, so one can imagine the Soviets were rather upset.
It's true, those of us who sailed past the Statue of Liberty came to a country of unbelievable freedom and opportunity. America truly is the greatest country in the world. Don't let freedom slip away. After America, there is no place to go.
There's Canada, Norway, Sweden. In fact, I'm pretty sure America is like 15th on the Quality of Life Index. America doesn't have a monopoly on freedom and opportunity. In fact, the myth of American exceptionalism is one of the biggest scams of the 20th century. So to conclude, none of what she says has anything to do with socialism, really. Her problem is with totalitarians. In fact, every time she mentions an actual economic policy or public works project, it was positive and uplifting. Every single one of the problems she mentions can be found in capitalist nations as well, so it's obviously not a problem inherent to socialism. People who frame Kitty's testimony as a rebuke of socialism either don't understand or willingly choose not to acknowledge that the National Socialists were just authoritarian corporatists that sprinkled in a few public works programs. Public works are not socialism. Government regulation is not socialism. Gun control is not socialism. It is the worker control of the means of production, which demonstrably did not happen in Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. And the social programs they did enact were only meant for the true German, which is a class distinction, which is antithetical to Marxist theory. In America today, marching to the same drumbeat as Nazi Germany is an indictment of our current capitalist nationalistic system, not socialism, which we don't have and are nowhere near having. It's just a boogeyman capitalist fanboys parade out to scare people into conformity with the status quo, a status quo that benefits capital holders at the expense of the proletariat. The fact wages have been stagnant for decades while the companies in question report record-breaking profits is a testament to this.